A respected social worker, a routine walk to the library, and a police officer who saw him as a threat, not a citizen. What started as a quiet act of discrimination turned into a storm of retaliation, anonymous threats, professional sabotage, and a system built to protect the badge, not the truth. But Miguel Santos didn't back down. He documented every step, rallied voices that had been silent for years, and forced a city to look at what it tried to hide. This isn't a story about revenge, it's about resilience, about what happens when one man refuses to shrink, and shows that justice, no matter how long it takes, is still worth chasing. Do you think Miguel did the right thing by going public? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you believe stories like this need to be heard. It was early spring in Eastlake, the kind of city where the sidewalks still held the memory of winter. Slush gathered along the curb, and a weak sun tried to warm the streets as people moved in thick jackets, eyes down, minds focused. Among them walked Miguel Santos. Tall pressed suit, messenger bag slung over one shoulder. He looked like every other commuter walking with purpose, but Miguel always carried something extra, a sense of alertness sharpened over the years. He'd grown used to scanning his surroundings not out of fear but habit, a quiet survival reflex. Miguel was a clinical social worker at the city's largest trauma hospital. Weekdays meant appointments, policy meetings, and paperwork. Saturdays, like today, were often spent reviewing case notes at the public library cafe. It was quiet, clean, with free Wi-Fi and no one looking over his shoulder. He liked the walk there. 2 long blocks from his condo to the main intersection, then 3 more down Willow Street. That morning, he'd stopped at the corner store for a protein bar and smiled at the clerk who always remembered his name. At the second intersection, just as he crossed the street, he noticed the cruiser. Black and white with Eastlake PD stenciled along the side, parked slightly too close to the fire hydrant. Its engine hummed. Miguel didn't think much of it at first. The cops around this part of town liked to park anywhere they pleased. But as he stepped up onto the next sidewalk, he heard the door swing open behind him. "Hey, you," came a voice. Sharp, masculine, not loud but precise. Miguel turned, confused. The officer was tall, white, maybe in his mid-40s, square jaw, mirrored sunglasses even though the day was dim. His badge caught the morning light. "You live around here?" the officer asked. Miguel nodded. "Yes, sir, just heading to the library." "What's in the bag?" "My laptop, work stuff." "Show me." Miguel blinked. "Sorry, is there a reason?" The officer took a step forward. "Don't get smart." Miguel carefully unzipped the messenger bag and held it open. Laptop, charger, a few folders. The officer glanced in, then back at Miguel. His face stayed unreadable, but his tone shifted slightly, hardening. "You got ID." Miguel pulled his wallet out slowly and handed over his driver's license. "Social worker, huh?" the cop muttered after flipping it over. "You one of those trauma counselors they got for the addicts now." "I work mostly with victims of assault and abuse." The cop gave a short snort. "Right, you part of that queer outreach thing too." Miguel froze. He'd heard it before in worse places from worse men, but it always hit the same way, the casual emphasis, the lack of shame. Miguel didn't react, didn't flinch. "Yes," he said simply. "I also help run our LGBTQ+ youth support group." "Why?" The cop smiled, thin and unfriendly, "Just curious." He handed back the ID but didn't step away. "We've had some complaints around here. Suspicious folks hanging out, loitering. Gotta stay on top of things." Miguel slipped the card back into his wallet. "I've walked this route every weekend for 3 years. Still, I'll be keeping an eye out. You have a good one now." The officer walked back to the cruiser like nothing had happened. Miguel stood still for a second. His hands trembled faintly, not from fear, more like rage held in check. He'd done nothing. Nothing except exist, walk, be seen. The interaction had lasted under 5 minutes, but something in the officer's tone, the way he said queer like a threat, unlocked something old inside Miguel. He didn't say anything as the cruiser pulled away, just turned and kept walking. But now his senses were sharp. Every noise, every movement seemed closer. He didn't go to the cafe, instead he made a turn and headed toward the courthouse square. A quieter park sat just behind it with benches overlooking a dried-up fountain. Miguel sat down, pulled out his phone, and opened the Notes app. Date, April 3, 2025. Time, 10:12 a.m. Officer approached me on Willow and 16th. No probable cause. Searched bag, asked for ID, made homophobic comment. He saved it, then took a photo of the cruiser he'd seen, just in case. He wasn't new to this. Over the years, he'd taught every intern in his hospital's justice outreach program the same thing: document everything. Assume no one else will remember your story unless you give them a reason to. He hadn't expected to need that advice for himself again, not after all this time, not in this city. That evening, over dinner, he told his partner, Jordan. Jordan set down his fork mid-bite. "You're kidding." Miguel shook his head. Did you get his name, badge number? No, but I have a partial plate and timestamp. Jordan leaned back, running his fingers through his short, dark hair. That's not just harassment, babe, that's a hate incident. You should file something. I will, Miguel said, but I need to do it right. We don't win if we come at them angry. Yeah, but still. I know, trust me, I know. After Jordan went to bed, Miguel stayed up at the dining room table. He pulled out his laptop and logged into the city's civilian complaint portal. He didn't file anything yet, just reviewed the process. 5 steps, uploads, witness statements, legal identification of the officer involved. The form asked for the officer's name, the badge number, or incident number. Miguel sighed, he hadn't gotten those. The next day, he stopped at the same intersection and waited. It took 3 more Saturdays before the same cruiser showed up again. This time, Miguel had his phone ready and the number on the side of the car in plain sight. He watched as the same officer walked into a coffee shop nearby. Miguel waited until he came back out, pretending to tie his shoe. He didn't make contact. Just snapped a photo as the man passed by. Later that week, he cross-referenced the badge number from public disciplinary reports online. Officer Brent Toller. Been with the Eastlake PD 15 years, commended twice. No formal complaints on record. But on a community blog, Miguel found an old comment anonymous from 3 years back about a white cop on Willow who seemed to have a problem with anyone gay or black. He bookmarked it. The next Saturday, he returned to the cafe with a folder. In it were printouts, screenshots, photos, timestamps, his own typed statement. He asked to speak to someone from the Eastlake Civilian Oversight Board. He got a name, Claire Withers, tall woman in her 50s, white crisp suit, kind eyes. She listened carefully as he explained, asked questions, took notes. I'm not interested in a vendetta, Miguel said. I want the city to take this seriously. I want to know I'm safe walking to a public library. Claire nodded. Let me follow up, and Miguel, thank you. A lot of people would have walked away and said nothing. Miguel nodded once. Yeah, but that's not me. And for the first time that week, he allowed himself to feel something besides caution. The first thread of determination, pulling tight. This was just the beginning. By Tuesday morning, Miguel was back at the hospital, his coat still damp from the drizzle outside. The trauma ward had already filled by 9:00 a.m. Domestic case in room 2, a teenager brought in from the East Docks with suspicious bruises in 4, and a gunshot victim under observation in the ICU. Miguel moved from room to room with practiced calm, jotting notes, checking on meds, offering quiet assurance. But his mind wasn't entirely there. Every time he passed a window and caught sight of the police cruiser parked on hospital grounds, standard placement for security, his chest tightened. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the kind of tension that grows when you know your world is shifting and you can't tell yet if it'll fall apart or come together. That afternoon, Claire Withers called. I brought your complaint to Internal Affairs, she said. They've acknowledged receipt but don't expect a fast process. Miguel sat in the break room, alone, staring at the vending machine. I didn't. They've requested a meeting with you to clarify details. You don't have to go alone. I won't. I'll bring legal support if it gets to that. Claire hesitated for a moment. Just so you know, Officer Toller has been named in 3 informal reports over the past decade. None escalated to formal discipline. But there's something there, something I've been watching. Miguel sat up straighter. What kind of reports? 2 were from transients, verbal harassment, rough handling, no follow-up. The 3rd was from a young man who never gave a name, said he was stopped outside a shelter and called a slur. We never found him again. Miguel's voice was quiet. That's how it works. Scare you fast enough and you never come back. Claire sighed. That's why I took your case seriously. We need someone who won't disappear, someone with credibility. He nodded slowly, watching the flicker of fluorescent light above him. You have that. By the end of the week, Miguel found himself mentioned quietly in hospital corridors. It started with glances, then a nurse in the elevator asked if it was true that he was going after a cop. He kept his answer simple, I filed a complaint, but the way word spread unsettled him. Some colleagues seemed concerned for him, others just avoided him. The head of social work, Denise Mallory, called him into her office the following Monday. Denise was sharp, respected, known for running a tight department and defending her team when needed. She closed the door and folded her hands over a pale blue notepad. I've had a few phone calls, she said, watching him carefully. From city admin, a few questions about you. Miguel raised an eyebrow. I've worked here 6 years without a single complaint. I know that, Denise said quickly. That's not what this is, but apparently your name is on some memo that was sent to the precinct. Someone flagged you. Flagged me for what? For being a potential liability if you're interacting with on-site law enforcement. Miguel stared at her stunned. I haven't changed anything, I haven't disrupted anything, I made a complaint through the right channels. Denise nodded, I agree, but there's pressure building. From above, people who want this to go away. Miguel folded his arms, I'm not the problem. No, you're not, but the system doesn't always care who the problem is. It just wants silence. After a long pause, she added, I support you, Miguel, officially and personally. If this escalates, I'll testify for you, but be smart. He left her office with a strange ache in his stomach. The real world was peeling back its skin to reveal the rot underneath. This wasn't just about one cop on a sidewalk. It was about a system built to close ranks the moment someone questioned its foundation. Later that week, Jordan suggested they meet with a lawyer. It's going to get uglier, he said. I want someone in the room with you who can push back. They met with Eleni Mendez, a civil rights attorney whose name Miguel had heard from a mutual friend. Eleni had a reputation for being calm, relentless, and incredibly thorough. She reviewed his file silently for several minutes, printouts, photos, a running document of his notes, and now a copy of the memo from city admin that had leaked to the hospital leadership. This is retaliation, she said plainly. It's subtle, but it's real. Miguel exhaled slowly. I didn't think they'd be so quick. They're protecting one of their own, and they're watching to see if you'll back off. I won't. Eleni smiled. Good, then I'll need your full documentation file. I'll submit a formal pre-complaint notice to the city and the police union so they know we're watching them back. By the time he attended the internal affairs meeting a week later, Miguel felt steady. He wore a navy blue suit, brought Eleni with him, and spoke clearly. He didn't embellish, he just told the truth. The way Officer Toller had followed him, searched him without cause, said the word queer like it was poison. The way the same cruiser parked in the same area for weeks afterward, always watching. The officers taking the statement were polite but indifferent. One scribbled notes. Another leaned back and tapped his pen without writing anything at all. But when Eleni mentioned the 3 previous informal reports and the community blog post, one of them sat up straighter. Where did you find that? He asked. It's public, Eleni said. We've archived it. Miguel said nothing, but the mood in the room changed. Slightly, just enough to know they weren't expecting someone this prepared. When they left the building, Eleni handed Miguel a sealed envelope. What's this? Contact for a journalist, she said. I didn't want to mention it until now, but she's been covering police conduct in Eastlake for years. She'll take you seriously. Miguel ran his fingers across the envelope's edge. I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of visibility. You won't have a choice soon. They're going to try and get ahead of the story. She was right. A week later, an anonymous article ran in a conservative local blog. It didn't name Miguel directly, but described a hospital-employed LGBTQ+ activist with a history of stirring anti-police sentiment who was suddenly filing complaints. It hinted at leftist donors and woke legal pressure, and made sure to mention unconfirmed reports that he'd encouraged patients to sue officers before. Miguel read it once and tossed his phone onto the couch. They're going to come after your name, Jordan said quietly. I know. What are you going to do? Miguel didn't answer right away. He looked out the window of their apartment across the street to where children played in a muddy park. The city didn't change fast, but it did change. And people like him had to be part of that change, because if they didn't speak, someone else would be silenced. I'm going to keep going, he said finally. But we need more than a complaint now. Jordan nodded, then let's bring in the rest of them. Miguel turned back, the others. You think you're the only one Officer Toller's ever gone after. Miguel exhaled, I hope I'm not. And with that, the next phase began, not just to defend himself, but to uncover everyone else who'd stayed quiet. Not everyone had the job, the partner, the lawyer, but they had stories. And stories, when told together, became something else entirely. The meeting was held in a quiet back room of a community center near the east end of the city, tucked between a defunct credit union and a laundromat that hadn't raised its prices in a decade. Miguel arrived early, bringing a box of herbal tea, a pack of notepads, and his own nerves. The room smelled faintly of cleaning solution and dry erase markers, and someone had left a stack of folding chairs along the wall, just waiting to be used. It wasn't the kind of place that screamed revolution. But it was the kind of place where people listened. That was all Miguel needed. Claire Withers had helped organize the gathering quietly without making too much noise in city offices. She called in favors, reached out to contacts at shelters and LGBTQ+ groups, and said only that it was a conversation about safety and accountability. No names, no promises, just space to speak. The first to arrive was a woman named Alana. Mid-30s, athletic build, tightly cropped hair, with a hard look in her eye that softened slightly when Miguel introduced himself. She said she used to work nights at a bar on the edge of downtown and had been stopped 6 times in 1 month by Officer Toller for matching a suspect. The last time she was shoved against the wall so hard she tore her shoulder rotator cuff. She never filed. Her boss told her to let it go. Then came Jamir, a trans man in his early 20s who barely said 2 words when he walked in, but nodded when Miguel asked if he'd ever been harassed by the police. He opened his notebook, flipped through some pages, and held up a wrinkled citation, loitering, from 3 years ago. He'd been waiting outside a youth clinic. More people trickled in. A man named Glenn, a delivery driver, 2 high school teachers. A woman who didn't give her name but brought a photo of her brother with a black eye and said, "He won't talk to anyone, but this is what happened after a routine stop." By the time the clock hit 7, there were 15 people in the room. Miguel cleared his throat and stood. "I know some of you are nervous," he began. "I'm nervous too, but we're not here to make accusations without proof. We're here because what's happening isn't random, it's repeated, targeted. And it's covered up every time." He paused, watching them. "I filed a complaint against Officer Brent Toller. It wasn't the first time I was stopped by a cop, but it was the first time it felt like he was doing it for sport. I don't think I'm the only one, you're not either. And if we're going to be taken seriously, we need more than stories. We need records, dates, patterns. We need to show this isn't one mistake, it's a system." Alana nodded slowly. "You're saying we build a case?" "Yes, a real one, with timelines, supporting documents, cross-references. We can't just tell them what happened. We have to prove it in a way they can't ignore." Claire stepped in. "I've seen this before. These things get dismissed because people speak out alone. But together, it's different, especially when the people telling the story don't fit the narrative they want to paint." Miguel knew what she meant. He wore a suit, paid taxes, had a steady job and a partner who cooked quinoa and watched documentaries. But it shouldn't matter. The others in the room, some had records, others had unpaid bills, and some just had bad luck. They mattered just as much. Jamir quietly raised his hand. "I still have my hospital bill," he said. "From when I got shoved into a door after a stop, I didn't file anything either. I was scared." Miguel looked at him gently. "Do you remember what date that happened?" "I remember everything." That was how the room changed. One by one, people started talking. Names, dates, street corners. Toller's name came up again and again. Same part of town, same time of day. Always a reason, loitering, loud music matching a description, but always vague, always unrecorded unless someone pushed back. By the time the meeting ended, Miguel had a thick stack of scribbled notes and a list of names. Claire promised to follow up with the legal aid clinic to get statements collected and properly notarized. Eleni would start building a dossier, clean, structured, legally sound. And Miguel, he would keep showing up. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he spread out the notes across their dining table and started piecing things together. Post-it notes for every incident, colored markers. Red for verbal abuse, orange for physical contact, yellow for intimidation. He drew lines between them like he was mapping a city of pain. Jordan sat on the couch watching him. "You're making a caseboard. It's the only way to see the whole picture. What do you see so far?" Miguel stepped back. "That this isn't about Officer Toller having a bad attitude. He has a pattern, and I think the department knows." 3 days later, Miguel got a voicemail. "Mr. Santos, this is Detective Holloway from Internal Affairs. We've received an internal note about your recent meetings. I'd appreciate a call back at your earliest convenience." Eleni listened to the voicemail twice, then she smirked. "They're worried." "They should be. You're making noise, and they're going to want to know how loud it's going to get." Miguel nodded. "Good, let them listen." That weekend, he and Claire held another meeting. This time, more than 30 people came. A local church offered space, and someone from the local queer legal collective came to speak. Food was donated. A photographer offered to do portraits for anyone willing to go on record with their story. Not everyone was, and that was okay. Miguel told them that their voice mattered even if they didn't want their face in the paper. "Just having your name on the list," he said, "makes it harder for them to erase us." A quiet man in the back raised his hand. "What happens if we go public and nothing changes?" Miguel looked at him. "Then we try again and again until someone listens." Claire added, "The system doesn't change because people ask nicely. It changes because enough people say no more in the same breath." By the end of the week, they had 12 sworn statements, 6 medical reports, and more than 20 informal testimonies. Enough to build a pattern, enough to push forward. But pushing forward came with its cost. Miguel began to notice strange things. A cruiser idling near his street. 2 officers inside the hospital cafeteria who suddenly stopped talking when he walked in. One afternoon, he found a flyer taped to his building door, black letters on white paper that read, "If you hate cops, move out." He didn't tell Jordan right away. But when Jordan found it rolled up in the trash and confronted him, Miguel just said, "They're trying to rattle me." Jordan's voice was tight. "It's working. I can't stop now." "I'm not asking you to stop," Jordan said, taking his hand. "I'm asking you to be ready for when this goes national." Miguel was quiet for a moment. "It's not national yet. But it will be, once people see the faces behind the files." Miguel looked at the folders on their table. Photos, stories, timelines. He never asked for any of this. He wanted a quiet life, help people, be left alone. But the sidewalk didn't leave him alone. And now he was carrying more than just his own story. He was carrying theirs. The first official response came folded neatly in a cream-colored envelope, delivered to Eleni's office with the kind of care that made it feel important. But when Miguel opened it, he saw it for what it really was: a delay. A form letter with polite legal language thanking him for bringing your concerns to the appropriate department and assuring him that the matter was under internal review. He read the letter twice, then handed it back to Eleni. "They're not even pretending to investigate. They're waiting you out," she said. "They're betting you'll get tired before they do." "They're wronged." That same week, Eleni filed a formal civil rights complaint with the state's Office of Independent Review. This wasn't a simple workplace grievance anymore. It was a charge of targeted harassment under color of authority. It forced the city to assign a third-party investigator and put them on record for every step they took or refused to take. Miguel went back to work like he always did, but now the air had shifted. People watched him differently. Some looked at him with quiet support. A nurse he barely knew passed him a post-it note during a staff meeting that said, "Proud of you." But others kept their distance. One of the ER physicians, Dr. Klein, no longer responded when Miguel offered to update him on a patient's mental health status. And one afternoon, a security guard who used to smile when Miguel passed him in the hallway turned and walked the other way. Still, Miguel kept his rhythm. He counseled patients. He took notes. He responded to late-night family phone calls with the same compassion he always had. If the hospital wanted to make him feel like a stranger in his own department, they'd have to try harder. It was on a rainy Thursday that Claire called and said, "You're not going to like this." She was right. A report had surfaced, anonymous, unofficial, but being passed around among mid-level city staff. It painted Miguel as an activist with a personal vendetta against law enforcement, and claimed that his documentation appears to have been selectively compiled. There was no signature, no department seal, just rumors typed into a PDF and quietly circulated. Miguel didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, "They're building a case to discredit me." Eleni was already on speakerphone, "Which means we're in the right place. This is how power behaves when it feels exposed." Claire added, "I've seen this before. They don't fight fair. You need to decide now how far you're willing to go." Miguel didn't answer right away. He looked down at the calendar on his desk, circle around the date of his next meeting with the independent review investigator, another around the community testimony gathering next weekend. "I'm already in it," he said. "Might as well keep walking." 2 days later, the investigator arrived. Her name was Malika Brenner. Early 40s, dark curly hair pulled into a not no-nonsense tone but patient eyes. She carried a slim black folder and a digital recorder. Miguel met her in a neutral conference room at a nonprofit office. Eleni sat beside him. Malika introduced herself, explained the process, and then said, "I'll be asking you to go through every incident you personally experienced, and then walk me through your knowledge of the other testimonies. I understand you've collected community statements." Miguel nodded. "I've organized meetings, yes. People are willing to speak, some on record, others anonymously. But the pattern's clear. Officer Brent Toller uses his badge to harass, intimidate, and silence LGBTQ plus individuals in the city. Most of it happens just under the threshold of official scrutiny." Malika listened. She didn't interrupt once. When Miguel was done, she asked questions. "Do you have timestamps?" "Yes." "Photos?" "Yes." "Names?" "Some." She wrote everything down and requested digital copies of the files. By the end of the meeting, her calm tone had taken on an edge of gravity. "I've handled discrimination cases before," she said, "but the volume here, this isn't a one-off, it's systemic." Miguel met her eyes. "That's what I've been saying." Over the next few weeks, things began to shift again, this time in ways no one could miss. A journalist from a major metro paper reached out saying she'd received an anonymous tip about a civil rights complaint against the Eastlake Police Department involving multiple victims of anti-LGBTQ plus misconduct. She wanted to meet. Miguel hesitated. Eleni didn't. "We control the narrative now," she said. "If we stay quiet, they get to fill the silence." The interview was quiet off the record at first, just coffee in a neutral cafe with a reporter named Nadia Kim. She asked thoughtful questions, showed that she'd read everything thoroughly and respected the boundaries Miguel set. He didn't name victims without consent, he didn't speculate, he simply shared what he knew and what he could prove. The article dropped 2 weeks later. Pattern of abuse. Eastlake police officer faces multiple discrimination allegations. It was written with care, detailed, unflinching, and backed by quotes from Claire, Eleni, and even one anonymous hospital staffer who said, "Miguel Santos has always been the calmest person in the room. If he says something happened, believe him." The story went viral within the region. That same night, Miguel received an email from a woman in another city. "I saw the article. I grew up in Eastlake. Officer Toller pulled over my brother 4 times in 1 month. He was 16. He still talks about how scared he was. We thought it was just us. Thank you." Messages like that kept coming. Some were long, some were just a sentence or two, but every single one chipped away at the lie the city had tried to build, that this was a single incident, a misunderstanding, a professional grudge. Now the department had to respond. The mayor's office released a brief statement saying they take all allegations of discrimination seriously and would be fully cooperating with any external investigation. But the language was empty. No mention of Officer Toller by name. No admission of wrongdoing, just paper over cracks. Behind the scenes, things got colder. 2 of Miguel's regular patients were reassigned. A meeting he was scheduled to lead was abruptly canceled without explanation. Denise, his supervisor, apologized afterward, but her voice was strained. "They're trying to freeze you out," she said, "make you look unstable." Miguel sat across from her, exhausted but steady. "Then we turn up the heat." He filed a secondary complaint with the hospital's HR department, formal notice of potential retaliation based on protected civic activity. It forced a review, and it sent a message he wasn't going away. Jordan found him that night asleep at the dining table, pages of printed emails scattered around him, half a cup of cold tea still in his hand. He shook him gently awake. "You can't burn out before the fire starts," Jordan said. Miguel blinked, sat up slowly. "I'm okay." "You're doing too much." "I'm doing just enough." Jordan leaned against the table, watching him. "You still want to see this through." Miguel looked at the wall across from them, where he'd taped up a map of the city with colored pins marking every testimony. "Yes," he said, "not just for me anymore." Because every delay, every leaked memo, every anonymous threat only made the next step more certain. The system thought it was buying time. But what it was really doing was giving Miguel more space to organize, to document, to prepare. The walls they built around themselves, paper-thin denials, procedural stalling, polite deflections, couldn't hold forever. The cracks were showing. And soon everything behind them would have to answer. The subpoenas landed like quiet thunder, official notices. Real paper, real seals, real weight. The Office of Independent Review had escalated its inquiry. Officers from Internal Affairs, the Eastlake Police Union, and 3 civilian oversight board members were formally summoned to produce internal records regarding Officer Toller's field activity logs, complaint history, disciplinary actions, and GPS data from patrol cruisers dating back 5 years. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was action. Miguel stood at the edge of it, watching everything shift. The quiet resistance from City Hall turned into reluctant compliance. The police department's press liaison stopped issuing vague statements. Toller had been placed on temporary administrative leave pending investigation, which in practice meant he was still getting paid to stay home, but for the first time his badge wasn't being worn in public. Miguel didn't celebrate, he knew better. Instead, he sat down with Eleni and Claire in a glass-walled conference room borrowed from a nonprofit legal collective. The table between them was stacked with neatly labeled folders, witness testimony, incident maps, hospital correspondences, screenshots of anonymous threats, and every city communication related to the case. "This is where they push back," Eleni said. "We've forced movement. Now they'll try to shake the foundation." Claire nodded, "And they'll start with you." They were right. That week, Miguel's old college was contacted by someone claiming to be a background investigator for a news outlet. The registrar flagged it and called him directly. The person had asked if Miguel had ever been disciplined while a student and whether there were any incidents involving law enforcement or activism. Miguel thanked them for the warning, then called Eleni. "It's a fishing expedition," she said. "They're trying to dig up something, anything to spin a narrative." Miguel hung up and stared out the window of his apartment. It was late afternoon and the city below glowed with soft orange light. Normal life went on. Traffic hummed, kids played in the courtyard, and someone grilled burgers on a rooftop 2 buildings over. For a moment he hated how normal it all seemed. like he wasn't buried under the slow churn of an entire system trying to grind him down. Later that evening, Claire called. "I got a heads up," she said. "Eastlake PD's union is preparing a countersuit." Miguel turned away from the kitchen sink. "On what grounds?" "They're saying your complaint is defamatory, that it's causing emotional harm to Officer Toller and tarnishing the reputation of the department." Miguel laughed once, sharp and short. "They harass me, threaten me, smear me in the press, and I'm the one causing emotional harm." "They don't need the suit to stick," she said. "They just need it to scare you, make you hesitate." "Well," Miguel said, "they're wasting their time." Jordan came home that night with takeout and sat beside him on the couch, watching Miguel sort through files while ignoring the dinner cooling beside him. "You know you don't have to fight every second," Jordan said. "You can take a breath." "I don't want to," Miguel replied without looking up. "Then at least let me sit with you while you don't." They stayed like that for an hour, no music, no background noise, just the shuffle of papers, the scratch of a pen, the quiet strength of two people sharing space. The next public hearing was packed. Local news vans lined the curb. Protesters stood outside City Hall with signs that read "Equal Justice Now" and "Police Accountability Isn't Optional." Miguel arrived through the side entrance, escorted by Claire and Eleni. Inside, the council chamber was filled with a mix of allies and skeptics. City officials in suits sat behind long wooden tables. A few uniformed officers lined the back wall. Among them, Miguel spotted one of the men who'd been present during his first internal affairs interview. He looked directly at Miguel, then looked away. The chairperson called the hearing to order and introduced the special investigative panel. Miguel was invited to speak as a citizen complainant. He walked to the microphone with even steps and a folded statement in his hand. He didn't read it. Instead, he looked out across the room and spoke from memory. "My name is Miguel Santos. I'm a clinical social worker. I've lived in Eastlake for almost a decade. I pay my taxes. I help people in crisis. I've trained emergency responders on how to handle trauma cases. I've worked alongside police officers. I've also been stopped, questioned, and harassed because of who I am and how I live. And I'm not alone." He paused, letting the silence settle. "I filed my complaint because I knew I had the resources and support to stand through the storm. I filed it because people who didn't look like me or didn't have the same job I have were already suffering in silence. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because the badge doesn't come with a license to intimidate. It comes with responsibility, and when that responsibility is abused, we all suffer." He stepped back, the room stayed quiet. One person in the audience clapped, then another. Soon half the chamber was standing. The panel moved to questions, some were respectful, others were thinly veiled attempts to undermine him. "Mr. Santos, can you confirm whether you've ever publicly criticized the police before this incident?" "No," he said, "but even if I had, my right to file a complaint would still be protected by law." Another council member leaned forward. "Do you believe this is an isolated issue or an indictment of the department as a whole?" "I believe it's a pattern enabled by silence, and I believe silence has never protected anyone but the abuser." When the session ended, Miguel stepped outside into the rush of camera flashes and microphones. He said nothing. Eleni shielded him with her coat. Claire helped guide him through the crowd. Back at home, Miguel collapsed onto the couch and stared at the ceiling. "I can't tell if we're winning," he said. Jordan sat beside him. "You didn't do this to win. You did it so the next person wouldn't have to." Miguel didn't answer. He didn't need to. 3 days later, an email arrived from the Office of Independent Review. Subject line, FINDINGS notice, phase I conclusion. Eleni read it out loud over the phone. "There is sufficient evidence to support the claim that Officer Brent Toller engaged in a pattern of discriminatory conduct in violation of both departmental policy and civil rights law." Miguel let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "But it's just phase 1, Eleni said. "This means the evidence is credible. The next phase is disciplinary recommendation, and they'll fight it." "I know. And they'll come harder. I'm ready." Because what started as one man on a sidewalk had become something bigger, wider than any one report, deeper than any news article. It was becoming a reckoning, and Miguel Santos was no longer standing alone. It was a clear morning the day the city convened its disciplinary board hearing. Miguel stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie not because it needed it, but because he needed something to do with his hands. The apartment was quiet. Jordan had already left for work, slipping him a note that simply read, "Stand tall." Eleni picked him up just after 8. She wore dark gray, conservative. The car ride was mostly silent, filled with the weight of what they were walking into. Claire met them at the front of the city building, already speaking into her phone, arranging for later witness arrivals and coordinating with two civil rights observers from the state. This wasn't an informal chat anymore. This was a full proceeding. The hearing was held in a tall, wood-paneled room with long windows that let in too much light. A row of city officials sat at a bench on an elevated platform. Officer Toller sat at a table with his attorney to one side, wearing his dress blues. He didn't look at Miguel. He kept his hands folded tightly in front of him, jaw clenched like stone. Miguel didn't expect an apology, and he certainly didn't need one. What he needed was for the truth to be heard by the city, by the department, and by the people who thought this would all fade quietly into dust. The board chair called the hearing to order. They went over the charges: abuse of authority, discriminatory profiling, failure to document stops as required by protocol, and retaliatory behavior following a citizen complaint. Miguel listened without blinking. The list sounded clean, sanitized, almost too clinical for what it represented. The fear, the shame, the slow, quiet damage left behind every time someone like Toller pulled someone like him aside just for existing. The first hour passed in formalities, introductions, procedures, evidentiary standards. Then they called Miguel to testify. He walked to the small stand at the front of the room and raised his hand for the oath, swore to tell the truth, sat down. Eleni had prepared him for every possible question, every line of cross-examination. But it was something simpler that struck him when he looked out across the room. Behind the officials, a dozen observers sat in the gallery, most of them strangers, a few holding printed photos of loved ones. Victims who hadn't spoken yet, people who hadn't filed, but they were here watching. He answered every question clearly. He gave the dates, the locations, the exact phrasing of the words Toller had used. He described the moment he realized he was being watched, not protected. He handed over the documented record of every encounter and noted the days the cruiser lingered near his street. He explained how the complaint process worked and how difficult it was to even get that far. And then he paused. "I want to be very clear," Miguel said, turning slightly to look directly at the board. "This wasn't about a misunderstanding. This wasn't about a bad day or poor communication. Officer Toller made it clear through his tone, his posture, and his choice of words that I was not welcome in my own city, not because I'd done anything wrong, but because of who I am. And I'm not the only one. This was targeted, habitual, and systematic." Toller's lawyer objected to the phrasing. The board chair allowed it. When Eleni cross-examined Officer Toller, the air in the room cooled. She was exact, methodical. She asked him why he didn't log Miguel's stop in the official system. He claimed he'd forgotten. "Yet in the last 12 months, you logged every other citizen stop." "I log most stops," he replied, shifting in his seat, "except for Mr. Santos. It slipped my mind." She held up a photo taken from Miguel's phone. Toller's cruiser parked half a block away from Miguel's building, engine running, no apparent business. "What were you doing here at 7:42 a.m. on a Sunday morning?" she asked. "I was patrolling." "There are no incident logs for this street that day, no calls for service. Were you watching Mr. Santos?" "No," he said flatly, "I don't recall being there." "Your GPS log confirms that you were." Toller said nothing. His lawyer leaned in, whispering, then asked for a break. The board granted 10 minutes. In the hallway, Miguel leaned against the wall, watching the light flicker from the overheads. Claire joined him, carrying a bottle of water. "He's cracking," she said. "They thought you'd stumble, instead they are." Miguel nodded slowly, not feeling triumphant but heavy. The cost of truth wasn't measured in moments like these. It came in weeks of lost sleep, frayed nerves, the strange, isolating grind of dragging your trauma through bureaucratic halls while people waited for you to trip. When the hearing resumed, Eleni called two more witnesses, Alana and Glenn. They agreed to speak in person under oath. Alana walked straight back to the stand and didn't look at Toller once. She recounted how she'd been stopped while walking home after closing the bar, how she'd been pushed against a wall for resisting a search when she'd only asked why. She held up a medical record showing a torn rotator cuff. Toller had written nothing in the system about that night. Glenn testified about being stopped 3 times in 1 week while delivering food near Willow Avenue. He filed a complaint. It had vanished. No follow-up, no record. Eleni ended with one final image, a map. Projected on the large screen was a grid of Eastlake. Each dot marked an incident, red for those under oath, blue for written statements, yellow for anonymous tips. The pattern was undeniable, the same streets, the same officer. The hearing concluded late in the afternoon. The board announced it would deliberate and issue findings within 5 business days. Miguel stepped outside, blinking against the sunlight, and was met by reporters. He didn't say much, just a brief statement. This isn't about destroying a man's career, it's about protecting our communities. I filed a complaint because I believed the system could work if we held it accountable. I still believe that. He walked away with Jordan at his side, Eleni a step behind. The board's findings arrived 3 days early. Officer Brent Toller was found to have violated department policy in 3 documented instances, with substantial evidence of a discriminatory pattern in others. The report stated that while full termination was outside the board's direct authority, they recommended immediate suspension without pay and the opening of a broader departmental review. It wasn't the end, but it was a beginning. Within a week, the mayor's office announced a joint task force to investigate internal misconduct across all precincts. The department's internal affairs head resigned quietly, and the city council held an emergency vote to expand the oversight board's authority. Miguel returned to work on a Tuesday. No more rumors in the hallway, no more sideways glances. Denise met him in her office and said simply, "You did it." "No," Miguel said, "we did it." The damage wasn't undone, it never would be, but something had cracked open, and from that crack light was starting to pour through. 2 months had passed since the board released its findings. Miguel no longer looked over his shoulder walking home. The cruiser that used to idle outside his street was gone, no anonymous notes, no sudden reassignments at work. There was still pressure, still a quiet tension whenever a news story broke in the press or another name surfaced from a nearby district, but the air around him had shifted. Weight hadn't vanished, but it no longer pressed on his chest. The city had begun making changes, though most of them came wrapped in cautious language. The department pledged to update training protocols around LGBTQ+ sensitivity. A new policy required officers to log all civilian interactions with a timestamp and GPS data. Small things, technical things, but real. Miguel watched it all with guarded eyes. Justice hadn't come all at once. It rarely did. It came in fragments. A headline, a committee vote. A late-night message from someone who once thought they'd never be believed. He had one of those messages saved on his phone, a voice memo from a man who hadn't given his name. "I just wanted to say thank you. I left Eastlake years ago. Couldn't take the stops, the stares, the way they looked at me like I was already guilty. What you did, it's the reason I might come back." It wasn't vindication, but it was something close. A reminder that this had never just been about the sidewalk or even about Officer Toller. It had been about visibility and consequence. That summer, Miguel was invited to speak at a statewide civil rights symposium. He almost said no. He wasn't looking for a podium, didn't want to become a symbol, but Jordan had gently nudged him. "You said you did this so others wouldn't have to," he said. "Now you have a chance to teach people how." So he went. The auditorium was modest, filled with nonprofit leaders, community advocates, and a surprising number of young police cadets. Miguel kept his speech short. He didn't tell the whole story. He told only what they needed to hear. That first stop didn't last more than 5 minutes. 5 minutes was enough to change everything. You don't need hours to hurt someone. You don't need bruises. All you need is a uniform, a smirk, and a message: you don't belong here. My job isn't to make you comfortable with my story. It's to make sure you understand the system that allowed it. Afterward, 3 people came up to shake his hand. A fourth, a woman from another town, said she was planning to file her own complaint against a local officer. She asked if he had advice. Miguel said, "Document everything. And find people who won't let you carry it alone." Back in Eastlake, things kept moving. Claire had been appointed to the newly expanded Oversight Board, now with legal authority to issue disciplinary recommendations directly. Eleni had picked up 2 new clients, both cases involving LGBTQ+ discrimination by law enforcement. And Miguel returned to the library on Saturday mornings, this time without hesitation. He sat by the window again, just as he used to, but now there were notes in his bag labeled with things like policy draft review and training consultation. The city had invited him to consult on community police relations, and though he still didn't trust every handshake, he said yes. Not because he wanted to be the face of anything, but because he knew that people inside the room made all the difference. There were quiet moments too. Nights when the files stayed closed and he sat on the couch with Jordan watching cooking shows. Sunday breakfasts at the little corner diner where the server knew their order. Walks through the park without thinking about who was watching. One evening in September, Miguel hosted a dinner. Not a fundraiser, not a strategy meeting, just food. He invited the people who'd been part of the story: Claire, Eleni, Alana, Glenn, and a few others who had testified but hadn't wanted their names public. They gathered in his apartment with mismatched chairs pulled around a too small table and passed dishes back and forth while music played low. Glenn made a toast midway through the meal. "To standing up," he said, "to not letting them wear us down." There were no speeches after that, just laughter, second helpings, and the soft sound of people who knew what it meant to fight and still find room to enjoy the night. Later, when the guests had gone and Miguel was washing dishes with Jordan humming in the next room, he paused, hands under the warm water. "This was never supposed to be my fight," he said aloud. Jordan stepped behind him, wrapped his arms around his waist. "It chose you." Miguel nodded. "I just wanted to go to the library." "And you still can." That night, Miguel opened a notebook he hadn't touched since the beginning. Inside were his first notes, times, dates, emotions scribbled in the margins. He read through them slowly, remembering the fear, the calculation, the moments he nearly stepped back. At the very bottom of the last page, he wrote a single sentence: "We weren't quiet and they couldn't silence us." He closed the book. In the months that followed, Officer Brent Toller quietly resigned from the Eastlake Police Department. No ceremony, no press release. The department called it a personnel matter. But the community knew, the survivors knew, Miguel knew that wasn't the end either. New complaints would come, the work wasn't finished. But now there was precedent, now there was documentation. Now there were names and faces and policies rewritten because someone refused to shrink when the system pushed back. Miguel never called himself a hero. He hated the word. What he had been, what he still was consistent. Calm, focused, strategic. The same man who walked the same sidewalk but who now carried a different weight. It wasn't the weight of trauma anymore. It was the weight of knowing he'd done something that couldn't be undone. The next time someone was stopped without cause, there would be a record. The next time someone filed a complaint, there would be proof that someone had won. And when the system whispered that nothing could change, they'd have to reckon with the fact that it already had. On the last day of the year, Miguel stood in the park outside City Hall. Snow had just started to fall, light, scattered, soft. He watched the wind push it across the benches and remembered standing in that same park months ago, hands shaking, unsure whether speaking up would cost him everything. Now he just stood still, breathing in the quiet. The city hadn't healed, but it was listening, and that was enough for now.